won't let anyone take this. This proves that I am the king of this castle. It is the core of this world.
That rat bastard. That's how he sees me, isn't it?
Yo, pervert! Were you waiting to ambush us?
I just made it easier to find you. I'll dispose of you myself. Right here, right now.
That's our line, you sexually harassing D-bag!
What a selfish misunderstanding.
How is it a misunderstanding? You were doing things that you kept in secret from others.
People around me were the ones who kept it secret. Adults who want to share in my accomplishments. Students who have the drive to become winners. They willingly protect me so that we all may profit from it.
Profit?
There are too many imbeciles who don't understand that. Including naive brats like you and that girl who tried to kill herself.
True, she's a total idiot. Letting you manipulate her, trying to commit suicide. And I'm even more of a dumbass for not realizing that. But no matter what kind of fool someone might be, they don't need your permission to live their lives!
Drop the attitude, you mediocre peasant. There is no wrong in using my gifts for my gain. I'm a cut above all other humans.
Above? You mean beneath? You're a goddamn demon obsessed with your sick desires!
That's right. I'm not like you. I'm the demon who rules this world!
Today is the release of a new Persona game, and we should all be happy about that. It's not a completely new game, of course, it is Persona 5, but Persona 5 Royal does bring a new character, new story arc, new endings, new personas, and a whole bunch of new features in the dungeons and whatever, that it is much more than a simple DLC as well. It's a substantial addition, and if you were to look back at Atlas itself, look at Catherine and what Atlas did with Catherine the remaster, whatever it's called, on PlayStation 4 compared to the original, where they added an entire new character and integrated it into the story, so it was substantial and really felt like a new game. You're basically there with Persona 5 as well. The problem is, I guess, that Persona 5 didn't need new contents at all, and that wasn't the issue that people had with the game, but yeah, it's definitely there. This is an even bigger game than the previous one, so if you love the previous, and most people do, there's a lot of merit to that game, and we'll talk about a lot of that in this video. But if you did enjoy the original, you're going to really enjoy this one. The new character is great. Unfortunately, in this video, you won't see much of her. I've deliberately limited the footage to the first dungeon because, out of respect for people who maybe haven't played the original Persona 5 and were looking forward to this, I didn't want to spoil anything too significant, and I didn't want to show stuff that was kind of really advanced and a little bit overwhelming for perhaps new players. The good thing about Persona 5 is because it's such a long and extended game, you do get plenty of time to ease yourself into it, and the first dungeon, which is about 15 hours long in itself, it really is a nice slow process of getting into the game, so I didn't want to intimidate people who maybe haven't played the original Persona 5 by showing them stuff that was too far into the game, as well as, of course, the spoiler issue. So you're only going to see the first dungeon in this video, and as a result you're not going to see too much of the new character, but I promise you she's great. She's a really, really nice character. One of my favourites in this game, actually, and if she had been in the original Persona 5, I might have enjoyed it even more than I did. But I do have issues with Persona 5, and the main point of this video, I guess, is to talk through some of those, because I do think that while it is a very good game, and I'll certainly be giving it a very good score with my review on digitallydownloaded.net, it's also not up to the standard of the previous two Personas. Both Persona 4 and Persona 3 were particularly good games, and Persona 4 particularly is a top 3 game of all time as far as I'm concerned. I have never stopped thinking about that game since originally playing it, and Persona 5 doesn't quite live up to that standard, unfortunately, but it does get close. And coming second to Persona 4 as a really good JRPG is by no means faint praise. The first thing I will say is that Persona 5 is too long. It was already too long with the original release, and with this re-release 0.5 version, if you will, it is too long, and the bloat does not get better with this version. The game takes about 100 hours to play through. I did play it through on a fairly casual speed when I first played the game, but it did take me over 100 hours to get through the entire thing. And once you get to that length, you hit the point where a game needs to be truly spectacular in terms of its storytelling and its mastery over just about every single element in order for you to see it as a classic. One of the great things about Persona 4, which I really appreciated, and appreciated more in hindsight having played Persona 5, was that it was relatively brief. It did get to the point fairly quickly with each of the main narrative arcs that it was driving at, and in total it was about a 40, 50, maybe 60 hour game depending on how fast you played, and that felt right. It was still long, obviously, it was still a major time commitment, but things moved at a pace that felt fair to the player. Persona 5 is a little bit bloated. Like I said, it takes about 100 hours to get through. I'm pretty sure people would be able to clock it in under 100 if they sped through, but if you're really enjoying yourself and you're actually trying to take the time to appreciate the story and all the various elements that went into the game, you're definitely looking at 100 hours, and that's too long. There aren't many stories out there that deserve to be that long, and all that the bloat does is start to remind you of the game's faults as it goes along. Now, the faults of the game are mostly to do with the gameplay itself. The narrative I will talk about as well. The narrative doesn't feel like it's overly bloated compared to the story, to the gameplay, but the dungeons in this game in particular just go on and on and on. I mentioned earlier, this first dungeon is 15 hours to get to the boss. And again, I have been taking my time with it and making sure I'm really paying attention to all the conversations and kind of really exploring around the place. But there's new stuff in this dungeon, or if it's not new stuff, I don't remember it from the original game, like this hunt to find these skulls and stuff, which do add to the length of time it takes to play through the dungeon. And this is just the first one. Later ones get more elaborate and have more complex puzzles to deal with and all that kind of stuff. And it really does weigh you down. You get to the point where you don't really want to go into the dungeons because you know you're going to have to spend such a substantial amount of time in there before you get to go back out and do the interesting stuff, which is the more visual novel narrative kind of stuff, which is about living your character's life, interacting with people, exploring Tokyo and all that kind of stuff. That's where the real appeal of Persona 5 is, and every time you go into one of these dungeons, you lose sight of that, and that's before we even get to the random dungeon thing that you also have to go through, which works a little bit like a roguelike in that the levels are randomized, and those are also particularly dull, but you have to spend a lot of time in there in order to progress. It's just draining, and Persona 5 Royal just gets more draining because it just adds to what's already there. The other reason I didn't enjoy the dungeons as much as the rest of the game was that your interaction with the other characters in Persona 5 is more limited when you're inside those dungeons. They obviously help you out with the fighting, but most of the time they're all just mute, following you around and waiting for you to get into the next battle. The actual interactions with the characters all happen outside of the dungeons, and Persona 5, much like its predecessors, really relies on you enjoying the characters. So that unbalance where you spend too much time in dungeons, not enough time in town, actually hurts the characterization of the game and its real strength. Persona 5's characters are a great bunch. I mean, whether you prefer the characters from Persona 3, 4 or 5 really depends on who you are. I don't think there's any objective way to suggest one group is better than the other. Personally, I prefer the characters of Persona 4 because Rise is in Persona 4 and she's my favourite character of all. I also really kind of like Teddy as the mascot character and Kanji as the kind of the alternative lifestyle character, but one that was really struggling. His narrative arc was really interesting and he was a well-written character, and I just connected with the characters of Persona 4 a little bit more. But Persona 5 has great characters. Lady Anne, Anne as she's actually known. Lady Anne is what Morgana, the cat thing, calls her. Anne's a great character with a great arc. Unfortunately for her, that arc finishes relatively soon because she's the character that the first dungeon is built around. Once you finish that dungeon after the first 15 hours, you then have about 75 hours of gameplay to look forward to, where Anne is part of your party and participates in conversations, but the story stops being about her. And yes, you can do the social links with her and finish out her story by constantly, talking to her and interacting with her in your free time in the outside world, but it just feels like her role in the game is largely done by the end of the first chapter, and that's another problem with the length of Persona 5. You get this really kind of intense look at a character, and each one of these characters you could almost build an entire story around, an entire game around in themselves. But once you're done with that character, the narrative has to move on, and I think the developers lost control of it a little bit when they were creating this game, and as a result really struggled to make sure that each of the characters were relevant throughout the entire experience. The new character just adds more to that. Like I said, she's a really good character, and she's got a great narrative arc, and I really like her, as she'd be my second favourite now in the game after Anne. But she just adds to that already existing issue that the game had. The final issue that I have with Persona 5 is a little bit more of a philosophical one, but one of the reasons that I really love Persona 4 was the way that it handled the awakening of each of the characters. So the point of each of the Persona games is that inside you there's this creature of immense power that will break out when you need them, and then becomes the persona that you fight your battles with, and so on. And in terms of the narrative, it has to do with your character coming to a realization about who they are, and with that comes a calmness and an acceptance of who they are as well. Now, Persona 4 really drove that theme home perfectly, because each of the dungeons in that game was actually a manifestation of the character that you were effectively going to add to your party. So you would go into the dungeon of, say, Rise, because I've already mentioned her. You're going to Rise's dungeon, and as a reflection of her character, that dungeon is kind of modelled after a strip club. It has that kind of really powerful thumping kind of club-like music. It's all very overly sexualized and stuff, and that's Rise's, that's a reflection of Rise's inner mind and turmoil as she comes to terms with who she is as a pop idol and kind of, celebrity. And it's a really impactful thing by the time you get to Rise and fight her battle and then help her come to terms with who she is. You have this really powerful moment, narrative beat, that sticks with you well after the game's done. Persona 5 decided to do a more traditional thing, where each of the dungeons is run by a boss. And that boss is related to the character in some way. So to use this one that you're seeing on the screen in front of you as an example, the boss of the first dungeon is one of the teachers that is being quite abusive to Anne and her friends, and it leads to one of her friends attempting to commit suicide. And then that's when Anne comes to realize that she can't tolerate what this guy's doing anymore, and she comes to that realization, develops a persona power, and then you use it to defeat the boss. Each of the bosses in Persona 5 is a little bit like that, where it's more the character coming to realization through a conflict with an outside being, that they are able to develop their powers. Thematically, I find that to be a little bit more mundane. It's something that we've seen in plenty of JRPGs in the past. There are no end of games where the end boss is some kind of dark reflection on a person that they need to defeat and overcome in order to come to terms with who they are. It's a really common narrative trope, and what it does, it doesn't give you that intense feeling of being inside the psyche of the character and really getting to know them, so you don't end up with that same level of connection to the characters. You certainly feel bad for Anne and every one of the other characters who are done wrong by some way in the world, but at the same time, you don't have that intense experience of having kind of been tapped into their psyche to try to help them come of age and realize their place in the world. I just found that in Persona 4 to be such a powerful philosophical idea and topic theme to explore, and I just was quite disappointed that Persona 5 felt like it was regressing a little bit by going back to a more kind of traditional boss and dungeon structure. Now, with all of that said, Persona 5 is an amazing game with some incredible combat systems, some great art design. It's very intelligent in a lot of places. It says some great things. It has some great themes running through it. And I would certainly recommend that everybody play it at least once. One of the consequences of the game being so long is that you don't really feel like playing it again after you finish it once. So I've actually been really privileged to have the excuse to play it through again because of this re-release with Persona 5 Royal. I've appreciated things through the narrative that I kind of skimmed over the first time around because I didn't know what was coming, but in hindsight, once you know the full extent of the story, there are parts of this plot which really which take on a new tone once you know the full extent of what's going on, which is another reason I didn't want to spoil too much with this video. And I love the way that this game really taps into Arsene Lupin as a character as well. For people who don't know, Lupin is an incredibly popular character in Japan. He's actually a French literary character that was basically, well, not really officially, but was created as something of a foil to the type of character that Sherlock Holmes was from England. He's a gentleman thief, he's very dashing, he's very charismatic, but he's on the kind of the wrong side of the law as such. In Persona 5 Royal, your character personifies Arsene Lupin and his rebellious spirit, and that's why your first persona in this game is actually called Arsene. That's where that comes from, and that's where the gentleman thief theme that comes from, and that's why your club are all kind of gentleman thieves. And the way that the game kind of positions you on the outside of the law, but doing the moral and righteous thing, because you're rebelling against basically adults and the adult world, which you see as fundamentally unjust and unreasonable, is a really appealing theme, and certainly the game's overall narrative looks into that in a really interesting way. So for that reason alone, it's well worth playing. But yeah, Persona 5, it's a great game. It's just not quite up to the standards of Persona 4, but then Persona 4 is a top 3 game of all time, so it's a bit hard to top that. Thank you for watching this rather extended video. I hope it was interesting. Please do like and subscribe, and please do back me on Patreon if you enjoy my videos, and I can do a lot more of them. We'll see you at the next one.